Welcome to the YB Min Monthly Lecture Series, offered by the Center for Asian Business at Loyola Marymount University and funded by a grant from the International Communication Foundation of Seoul, Korea.
We are here to talk today about the evolving role of the Asian auto industry in the North American market. Before I get started, I do want to just really quickly explain who Auto Pacific is and why it is supposedly I know something about the industry. Auto Pacific is an automotive research and consulting firm that has been around since 1986. You can think of our company as being in two different buckets. The first bucket is consumer research. Within consumer research, basically we do both syndicated and proprietary studies. We have our own unique dedicated automotive research facility down in Tustin, about an hour or so south of here. The other bucket of Auto Pacific is industry analysis, and that is the division of Auto Pacific that I'm in charge of. Basically, industry analysis handles competitive intelligence services and sales forecasting for the auto industry. As we go through this presentation, we'll see data and insights that come from both of these sections of both of these two parts of Auto Pacific. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to see a show of hands here. How many of you own a vehicle from an Asian automaker? All right, so it looks like about half of you. Okay, that's exactly about what I thought. For 2010, we're projecting Asian vehicles to comprise about 49% of the US auto market. So I think we're pretty well represented right here in this room. So for this presentation, for this lecture, there are 3 points that I want to get across as we go through the lecture here. The first point that I want to get across is that the Japanese are now as American as apple pie, and that the Koreans are well on their way to being as American as apple pie as well. The second point is that the Chinese are coming, but they're forging their own path. They're not necessarily going to be following the example that the Japanese and Koreans have set before them. The final point will be that the Chinese will have a massive and very, very profound impact on the US automotive market when they finally arrive here. All right, so why don't we get started? Starting off with the Asian automakers, American as apple pie. It's hard to believe, but at one time, Japanese vehicles were considered cheap junk. The first Japanese car sold here in the United States was the 1958 Toyopet Crown. It was built by the company that we now know as Toyota. Throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, and even the early part of the 70s, the Japanese cars were basically considered to be inexpensive, disposable junk. But look where they're at now. I would hardly consider this vehicle, the Lexus LFA, which costs over $400,000 to be cheap junk. So quite the progression that we've seen over the last few decades. So how did the Japanese automakers get to be where they are? Well, initially, it was the baby boomer generation that really fueled their growth. And it was several aspects of the baby boomer generation that really made this happen. The first of which was the anti-establishment thinking and the willingness to think out of the box that the baby boomers represented when they were young. Picture of Woodstock here. And that anti-establishment thinking and out-of-the-box thinking also led them to be willing to consider something out of the ordinary, something not of the establishment when it came to automobiles. That especially became the case when we had two fuel crises in the 1970s. Now, during this time, fuel prices shot up out of control, and all of a sudden, these big gas-guzzling American cars with big, giant V8 engines, all of a sudden didn't seem so appropriate anymore, and all of a sudden, these young baby boomers were very attracted by the idea of these fuel-efficient Japanese imports. Sound kind of familiar? Kind of sounds like something happening sounds like something happening today. The final thing that really got the baby boomers on board with Japanese cars was the quality. Unlike many of the contemporary Detroit cars of the time, these Japanese cars started up every morning, they didn't break down, and they'd give their owners many, many trouble-free miles. This was very different from Detroit cars at the time, which frequently broke down, simply just didn't work the way they were supposed to. Ultimately, the Japanese earned tremendous loyalty from these young baby boomers because of all these factors, and that continues till today. The majority of Toyota owners, for example, are in fact baby boomers that have been buying Toyotas year after year after year for the last several decades. In the 1980s, Honda, Nissan, and Toyota all established assembly plants here in the United States. And ultimately, it was this North American production and product development that really helped strengthen their presence here in the United States. The way that many consumers saw it, if these companies, if these Japanese automakers were employing Americans and therefore contributing to the American economy, that made them just as American, or perhaps even more American, than the domestic big three automakers that were shipping these jobs from Michigan down to Mexico. In addition to that, these Japanese automakers also exhibited, by and large, far less adversarial labor relations as well. Rather than viewing labor as the enemy, the Japanese automakers tended to view them as part of the team. And it might be oversimplifying things to say this, but this is part of the reason why most Japanese factories never unionized. There is virtually no UAW presence within the Japanese factories that are operating here in the United States. Also another factor is U.S.-specific product development. In the 1990s, the Japanese automakers, particularly Toyota and Honda, started developing cars that were specifically geared for unique U.S. market needs. You think about, if many of you who have traveled the rest of the world probably know that U.S. road conditions are very, very different from those conditions in Japan. Our roads are wider, our fuel is cheaper, Americans are physically larger than most Japanese, and therefore our cars are, the ideal car for an American is somewhat different from that of an ideal car for a Japanese driver. In the 1990s, the Japanese started developing vehicles specifically for the U.S. consumer mindset. And the end result of that was that a lot of these Japanese cars made for Americans were better American cars than American cars. Now, the Koreans are well on their way too. The Hyundai Excel was the first Korean car in the U.S. It was the debut vehicle from Hyundai in the U.S. and came to this market with an enticing price of $49.95. It's certainly, that very, very low price certainly got a lot of consumers' attention. And because Japanese cars had already by this point gotten a very high quality reputation, people assumed that this new Hyundai would be equally high quality. As a result, Hyundai sold about 250,000, or almost 250,000 Hyundai Excels the very first year they were here, which is a first-year sales record that hasn't been beaten since. Now, unfortunately, the quality ended up not being quite what people expected. They were, in fact, nowhere near what the Japanese were in terms of quality, and therefore, sadly, the Excel became the butt of many, many late-night jokes. Now, fast forward to today, and it's a very, very different story now. Here is the 2011 Hyundai Sonata. It's really a far cry from that old 1986 Excel. I mean, it's really a very, very attractive-looking car with a very, very high-tech features, and certainly it's not. It's nothing like that old Excel was back in 1986. Now, let me give you some historical context. Now, through the 1990s, once Hyundai suffered from that poor quality reputation from that first generation Excel, throughout the 1990s, Hyundai really just kind of suffered and just sort of limped along in the U.S. market. In 1999, the chairman of Hyundai decreed that quality would be the #1 drive at Hyundai. Hyundai was going to be the #1 quality automaker, and nothing was going to stop them from achieving this goal. So there was this tremendous effort to get the quality fixed. And around the same time, in 1999, in America, Hyundai introduced the now famous 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty that I think in many ways the Hyundai name has kind of become synonymous with here. So as a result, that 100,000-mile warranty really got American consumers' attention. American consumers started to be open to considering a Hyundai. And throughout this decade, Hyundai has certainly grown a lot. They've had a lot of success over this past decade. As this happened, we've also seen yet another shift in the mindset of Hyundai. Throughout most of Hyundai's history in the US, Hyundai's strategy was basically, let's build a vehicle that's almost as good as the best vehicles from Toyota and Honda and sell it for a cheaper price. So basically it was a similar product, low price strategy. Now Hyundai is shifting their mindset towards, let's build a vehicle that's the same price as our competitors, not lower price, but same price, but overachieve in terms of overachieve in key areas. This new 2011 Sonata is very much a product of that thinking. Its base price is comparable to that of a new Camry or an Accord. It's not cheaper; it's about the same price, but in return, you get best-in-class fuel economy, 35 miles a gallon on the highway, which is really impressive for a car of this size. Best-in-class horsepower, 200 horsepower, which is 200 horsepower from the base four-cylinder engine, which is better than what any of the other competitors do, and also really class-leading design. I mean, a Camry and an Accord really don't look this expressive. So certainly, they're really making some big progress in this market. Also, just like the Japanese did in the 1980s, the Koreans are really starting to establish manufacturing presence here. Hyundai's factory in Alabama has been in operation since 2006, and Kia opened their manufacturing facility in Georgia about half a year ago. So the Koreans are very, very rapidly approaching first-tier status here. Now, as we know, the Asian automakers have been very successful here in the United States, and based on the data that we've got from our company, that success is going to continue, if not perhaps even grow. What we've got on the bars on the left side represent Asian brand consideration from Generation Y consumers. So that's basically new vehicle drivers in their 20s and early 30s. On the right, we've got our total industry sample, so all new vehicle buyers. So if you look at the red, consumers in general are very, very likely, very willing to consider Japanese or Asian vehicles. Consideration for Asian vehicles is even higher in each of these brands' cases amongst these younger buyers. So younger buyers are even more willing to consider them. This pretty much helps guarantee their continued success in the US market. So what are some of the Asian automaker strengths compared to pre-bankruptcy Detroit? Well, there's three of them that really kind of stick out to me. The first is innovation. The Japanese in particular, and now the Koreans also, have always been very, very innovative. They may not invent all of the far-fetched technologies that eventually make their way into automobiles, but they are very often some of the first to get them in mainstream vehicles that just regular consumers like you or I can buy. So over the years, everything from mechanical advancements like variable valve timing in engines that provided greater fuel economy and greater power. Advanced technology like navigation. I believe it was Lexus that first introduced navigation to the US market back in the early to mid-90s. Progressive design. Back in the 80s, the Japanese were providing to the market very new, very international, very sleek-looking designs, while the American automakers were persisting with vinyl roofs and wire wheel covers. And manufacturing innovation, introducing concepts like lean manufacturing in US factories. Ultimately, that meant that US auto workers were producing extremely high-quality vehicles, whereas comparable workers from Detroit couldn't do the same. A second Asian automaker strength compared to pre-bankruptcy Detroit is the fact that they're less mired in the past. The domestic automakers here, many of them, in many cases, they've been mired in America-centric thinking. It's very hard, it has been traditionally very hard for the American automakers to look outside of Detroit. If you go to Detroit nowadays, or any time since the 1950s, all the vehicles there tend to be American cars. And you get a very warped sense of what the American automotive landscape looks like when you're in Detroit, because everything's domestic. Certainly here on the West Coast, half of you here don't drive or that probably close to half of you don't drive American cars. And in many cases, the American car companies are very, very much steeped in history. They're constantly reminiscing about how great American cars used to be. You know, the Mustang, you know, Corvette, you know, pickup trucks, you know, these icons of the American automotive landscape. Well, sadly, they've become, you know, less and less relevant in this new era. Yet the domestic automakers have, in many cases, really kind of clung to these ideals. Another relic from the past are old-style labor agreements and obligations. You know, everything from current UAW contracts to retiree pensions and healthcare obligations. These are very, very expensive things that the Japanese automakers, the Asian automakers, simply don't have. It's not a burden that the Asian automakers really have to deal with. Finally, the Asian automakers tend to embrace the future and not fight it. The Japanese automakers traditionally tend to think very holistically, and they tend to think very long term. What is our role 20, 40, even 100 years from now? What is our role in that future world, and what do we need to do now to be successful in that future world? It's a very different way of thinking than the domestic automakers here have traditionally operated under, you know, in many instances. The domestic automakers here are often thinking very short term, thinking about what their shareholders expect in the next quarter, and not really thinking very, very far ahead. What that means is that in many cases Detroit has been dragged kicking and screaming into the modern era. You know, things like you know, thinking of examples from the past, fuel injection, independent rear suspensions, things that are very, you know, universal today. The Detroit automakers are sort of dragged kicking and screaming, you know, into those technologies. Even hybrids, for example. Toyota pressed on with their hybrid technology, thinking long term, and now Toyota is the undisputed leader in hybrids. So there you go. The result of the Asian automakers' efforts in the U.S. market is that the Asians already own the majority of the U.S. auto market. The orange line represents the Asian automakers' market share, and the green line represents the domestic automakers' market share. This is Auto Pacific's 5-year forecast from 2010 through 2015. And throughout the next couple of years, you can see that we're forecasting the Asian automakers to continue gaining share in the U.S. marketplace at the expense of the domestics. Going on from 2013 forward, we see that gap closing just a little bit, mainly because in the post-bankruptcy era, General Motors, basically the domestic automakers, appear to be making some real strides. The next generation of American cars actually look to be pretty competitive in this new world. It's just too bad that it took a bankruptcy and a tremendous bailout to get them to that point. I want to pay particular attention to the chart on the right. What these charts represent are top-tier domestic and import manufacturer sales volumes, and share forecast. So again, this is going out to 2000. This is our projection for out to 2015. And what you can see here is that among the top tier of auto manufacturers competing in the U.S. market, there are really 3 tiers going on here. The top tier here, I don't know how well the colors show up, so I'll try to point them out the best I can. The top tier, the chart on the right, those lines represent General Motors, Ford, and Toyota. So that's the very top sub-tier of the automotive market in the U.S. So over the coming years, the 3 of them will be kind of duking it out for first place. The next sub-tier is Honda, which is kind of by itself in the middle in blue there. And then the third tier, the third sub-tier, is Chrysler, Nissan, and surprise, Hyundai. Yes, Hyundai is now in the top tier of automakers. They're selling as many vehicles as Nissan and Chrysler do. The fact that they're right in the same league with Chrysler is really pretty astounding to me. So the lesson, really the lesson here is that Asian automakers continue to eat away at domestic market share and volume. All right, so moving on to our next point. The Chinese are coming. Yes, they are. But they're not necessarily following the Japanese and Korean models. They're really going down their own road here. The Chinese have certainly been in the press a lot, and most of this press is really pretty positive. I mean, you know, yeah, they're growing tremendously, and certainly at some point we can fully expect to see them here in this market. Now, we in the auto industry are often guilty of making fun of Chinese cars. Now, there are no actual Chinese-built cars yet here in the U.S. market yet. They're coming, but they're not here yet. But ever since the company opened in 1986, Auto Pacific staffers have gone to every major international auto show, and as a result of that, we get to see all the latest makes and models, including recently these Chinese vehicles. And as we poke around these Chinese vehicles, you know, it's hard as automotive professionals not to poke fun and chuckle at, you know, the poor panel fits, you know, the poor fit and finish, the poor quality, you know, in some cases even the funny smells that are emanating out of these Chinese cars. However, assuming that this isn't going to change is foolish. And why is this? It's because cars ultimately aren't rocket science, and the Chinese are already putting rockets into space. A rocket is a far more complicated piece of machinery than a car ever will be. And if the Chinese are capable of getting rockets up into space, there's absolutely no reason why they can't build a finely engineered vehicle with precise panel gaps, perfect quality, and all the sorts of things that American consumers expect. So let's do a little comparison of the US auto market and the Chinese auto market. Now, in 2009, we had what we in the auto industry call the carpocalypse, along with the economic collapse that we all saw. Of course, the auto industry collapsed with it. In 2009, the industry sold 10.4 million units, which was a really pathetic number. It wasn't. That's the worst number. That's the worst annual sales number since 1982, and that represented a 21% decrease from 2008 volumes, which in turn was a huge decrease from 2007 volumes, which was 16.1 million units. So just in 2 years, it went down from 16.1 down to 10.4. So you know, very, very bad news here in the US. Now, on the other side of the globe, it's a very, very different story. China sold 13 million units in 2009. That's a 46% increase over 2008 volumes. And if you remember, the US was 10.4 last year. This now means that the Chinese auto market is now the biggest auto market in the world. Yes, they're bigger than us. Now, if you keep in mind that China has a population of 1.3 billion people, that means that China is adding 2 million units a year of capacity just to keep up with domestic market demand. The implication there is also that the Chinese are, quite frankly, at this moment, plenty busy enough trying to meet the demands of their own home market. So exports really aren't the top priority on their mind right now. So it may still be a few years yet till we see actual Chinese-built vehicles here in the US market. Okay, let me give you a little bit of early historical context for the Chinese auto industry. The Chinese auto industry was pretty much non-existent until the last couple of decades. Prior to the last couple of decades, the primary mode of transportation for Chinese citizens was bicycles, and in some cases buses and trains. In the last couple of decades, the Chinese started building a few vehicles here and there. And they started off with licensed and reverse engineered versions of Western vehicles. This is one of the first small Chinese cars. I can't remember the name of the manufacturer. I should, but I don't. But this car is basically a reverse engineered copy of the old 1980s era, actually the 1970s era Citroën AX, which is a little French hatchback. Now, if anyone here is familiar with French cars, to think of a poor quality copy of a French car is a really, really frightening thought. Now, all foreign automakers that are playing in China have to have a local manufacturing partner if they want to compete there. Volkswagen has been around the longest in China. Their partner is FAW, First Auto Works, and they're the second biggest foreign automaker there. The first biggest foreign automaker there is, in fact, General Motors. So how are Chinese cars now, today? Well, in terms of design, well, they're still learning. I don't know what you think, but that white car on the left is kind of funny looking. The little van on the right is equally funny looking. And as I mentioned earlier, currently these Chinese cars really aren't at a level of quality that American consumers expect. Also, there are blatant copies running around all over Chinese roads right now. At first glance, these may seem like familiar vehicles, but in fact they're not. The black SUV up there is something called the CEO. Kind of looks like a BMW X5. In fact, it looks a lot like a BMW X5, but in fact it's an unlicensed copy of a BMW X5. Down there, the red car, that is the new small hatchback from a Chinese company called Lithiumion. What does that look like? Yeah, it looks like a Mini Cooper, except that it's not a Mini Cooper. It's a Chinese copy of a Mini Cooper. Then up there, on the upper right, that vehicle actually made its debut last week at the Beijing Motor Show. One of my colleagues actually saw the vehicle in person. It's sort of a funny amalgamation of a Porsche Cayenne with a Bentley grille on it, and then the small white car on the lower right there looks suspiciously like a last generation Mercedes C-Class, except it's not. Again, it's a Chinese copy of a C-Class. So in China right now, intellectual property is very, very difficult, and in many cases even impossible to protect. And the quality, as I said, is pretty bad by Western standards. But what do you expect? They just really got started. Remember, 2 decades ago, there wasn't a Chinese auto industry. This is similar to how the Japanese and the Koreans got started after all. The Japanese and Koreans also copied Western designs until they got familiar enough with automaking, and they copied them until they learned how to make them themselves, and have been very successful ever since. And like the Japanese and the Koreans, they're very, very fast learners. This vehicle here is the FAW, or actually it's either a Shanghai VW or FAW VW. This is a specific Chinese Volkswagen. It's the Volkswagen Bora, designed specifically for the Chinese market. So again, now there are vehicles being developed by foreign automakers specifically for China with Chinese input. This vehicle was designed by Volkswagen engineers in China, not in Germany, and these are being designed for that market's unique tastes and usage patterns. So this is just like what the Japanese did in America. And the important takeaway here is that since established automakers have to pair up in joint ventures with native Chinese automakers, that means that expertise from these established automakers, that all gets passed down to the Chinese. And that means the Chinese are going to learn how to build proper cars really, really quickly. Just to give you some context on just how fast the Chinese auto market is growing, this is Chinese auto production since the early 1990s all the way up to last year, 2009. And you can see that exponential growth. Throughout the 1990s, Chinese car production was about in the 1 million unit range. And remember, this is for a population of 1 billion plus people. So really back in the 90s, vehicles that were being built in China were really generally for, high-ranking party officials, the few millionaires that existed. But generally speaking, regular middle-class Chinese citizens couldn't own cars. They couldn't afford it. Throughout this decade, that has rapidly changed, and the biggest jump actually came between 2008 and 2009. You can see that about 45% jump in Chinese auto production to meet this blistering demand for new vehicles in China. Now, over this past decade, the Chinese have exhibited some strong ambitions and made some strong statements about wanting to enter the U.S. market. A company called Chery was first, and they teamed up with a man named Malcolm Bricklin, who's seen on the right there, who created a company called Visionary Vehicles, specifically for the purpose of importing these Chinese Chery vehicles into the United States market. If anyone has heard of Malcolm Bricklin, many regard him to be the ultimate con man, but whatever you think of Bricklin, the fact is that the Chinese came really rather close to offering a vehicle for sale here back in 2005. In 2007, Geely announced that they were going to come to the US market. Shortly thereafter, other companies like BYD announced that they had plans to come into the US market as well. So where are they? Why haven't we seen these Chinese vehicles? Why aren't they on the roads right now? Well, simply put, they've all found that getting established in the US market is a lot harder than it looks. Our company has actually worked with 3 different Chinese auto manufacturers and helped them do their due diligence. To figure out what it took to get into the US market, what it was going to take, what they needed to do to their current vehicles to make them saleable here. They all found that, yikes, this is really, really pretty difficult. So what's so hard about it? Well, first, we in the US have probably the toughest homologation standards in the world. We have very, very specific requirements on the sort of beam that comes out of the headlights, bumper strength, where the reflectors go, all the thousands and thousands of little things that make a car saleable for the US market. That's very hard and difficult and expensive to do. Related to that is safety engineering. Chinese safety engineering isn't quite there yet. And our market here in the US, well, we place a tremendous value on safety. Just to give you an example here, these are two comparable vehicles. The one on the left is the latest Ford Taurus. The one on the right is the Chinese Brilliance BS6. Kind of a big difference there. The Taurus, you can see the safety cell. This is the exact same crash test. This is a 40-mile-per-hour frontal offset test. And you can see in the American car to the left, the safety cell is virtually intact as the front end absorbs all the impact. The Chinese car on the right, you can see the entire passenger cell just collapsing collapsing under the same impact. In fact, in that very crash test, the steering column ended up poking through the steering wheel and impaling the crash test dummy right through the chest. So that wouldn't have been very much fun. Certainly not saleable for the US market. As I mentioned earlier, quality, it's just simply not there yet. In many cases, a lot of American cars don't even meet Americans' standards for quality, to say nothing of these Chinese cars. Quality takes time to build up. Just ask Hyundai, just ask the Japanese. Finally, the distribution and retail network. Building one of these is very, very expensive. Think about all the dealerships across the country. Toyota has probably about 1,500 dealerships. General Motors, before the bankruptcy, had about 3,000. And there are distribution centers that have to distribute all the cars and all the parts to all these dealerships. I mean, this is very, very complicated, very, 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 very expensive. Again, it's very, very difficult to do, and it's a lot harder than it looks. So as a result, we are starting to see a big shift in strategy on the part of the Chinese. Rather than try to come into this market with their own vehicles, the new strategy seems to be, hey, let's acquire established brands and use them as points of entry into the US market. If they buy an established brand, well, they're essentially buying into vehicles that already have the expected levels of product design, execution, quality, and reliability that Americans expect. Also, they're buying into that American distribution network that's so difficult and expensive to build up. So first up is Geely. Some of you may have heard that Volvo is now owned by the Chinese. Geely bought Volvo last month. The sale is expected to close third quarter of this year, and therefore Volvo is no longer a Swedish company, nor is it under the control of Ford as it has been for the last decade or so. It's about to go into the ownership of the Chinese. And remember the other slide that I showed about the steering column impaling the crash test dummy? with Volvo's reputation of safety and all the expertise in that field they have, I figure that Geely will learn a lot about safety in the coming years. There were other Chinese automakers that tried to follow that same strategy. BAIC, Beijing Auto Holdings, attempted to buy Saab from General Motors late last year. That didn't work out. Also last year, Sichuan Tengzong attempted to buy Hummer from General Motors last year. That didn't work out either. But the important takeaway here is that there's a common thread behind all these three brands. And the common thread is that none of these are entry-level brands. In fact, these are all relatively premium brands. They're not, these aren't your Kias or Suzukis. These are pretty, pretty premium-priced vehicles. The takeaway here is that the Chinese stand to learn a lot from the experience of these American premium consumers, and filter those learnings downward as they expand further out. Incidentally, India seems to be following a very similar strategy. A couple of years ago, Tata Motors, India's largest car manufacturer, bought Jaguar and Land Rover. So those new Jags and Land Rovers that you see on the road, they're owned by the Indians. All right, so let's move on to the third and final point, which is that the Chinese will impact the US auto market in some really, really profound ways. Now, eventually, as I said earlier, the Chinese will eventually bring their homegrown cars to US showrooms. This shot is actually from our office. We did a project with Lithiumion Motors to see how US consumers would react to their cars relative to some of the established competitors. So this silver car here and that white car there, those are Chinese Lithiumions in the midst of a Chevrolet Aveo, Hyundai Accent, and a Kia Rio. Anyways, when these vehicles get here, what sort of market environment will they find? Well, the answer might really surprise you. Let's look at some of our consumer data. We find that US consumers are really actually pretty open-minded. This data comes from our 2009 Research Suite database. So it's, and in that questionnaire, we ask new vehicle owners, are you willing to consider a vehicle from China? Are you willing to consider a vehicle from India? Well, the answers we got from that were really, really surprising. We found that 15% of US auto consumers are willing to at least consider a Chinese branded vehicle. And actually, that seemed to match up pretty well with the show of hands I saw here earlier. Just for reference, 11% say they will consider an Indian branded vehicle, which is almost as high. And from that same research, from that same survey, we asked consumers to write in some verbatims as to why they would or would not consider a Chinese vehicle. And here's some of the answers we got. Really pretty surprising. Origin is irrelevant. The car itself is what's important. They make quality products that we use every day, so I'm sure they can make a vehicle that's just as good. And my favorite one here at the bottom, why wouldn't I? If it meets my needs, I do not care what country it's from. My current vehicle could have been built in China for all I know. So there you go. The American consumer is really pretty open-minded to the idea of owning a Chinese vehicle. And what's even more fascinating is when we look at who these Chinese vehicle considerers are demographically. Our total sample of about 35,000 respondents compared to people who say they would consider Chinese vehicles. And what do we find here? We find that Chinese vehicle considerers are much more likely to be female, 51%. They're much younger in age. They have a median age of 45, which is a full 11 years younger than our total sample. They're better educated. 63% of those Chinese hand raisers have a college degree. And they have the same income as our total sample, except that they're 11 years younger. So these are some pretty startling demographics. Basically, people who are willing to consider Chinese cars. They tend to be female, they tend to be younger, and they tend to be relatively affluent for their age. These are pretty good demographics to me. And speaking of that younger consumer, well, the sort of high-tech consumers, or the sort of high-tech products, consumer products that younger consumers like, well, so many of them are already made in China. I mean, all these things here, you know, iPads, iPhones, Wii's and all that, they're built in China. So therefore, why would a Chinese car really be that much of a stretch? If the Chinese can build high quality electronics, why couldn't they build a high quality car? Also keep in mind too that younger consumers just in general have less prejudice against new brands in general. Also, people who are willing to consider Chinese cars are more willing to consider many higher end vehicle types. They're not necessarily looking for that cheap bargain basement vehicle. This chart is a comparison of Chinese car considerers versus Chinese car rejectors, and this is their future vehicle segment consideration delta. What we see here is that about 22%, or sorry, let me rephrase that. Chinese car considerers are 22 percentage points more likely to consider a luxury or large SUV than Chinese car rejectors. So again, they're much more likely to consider these very high-end vehicles. They're about 18 percentage points more likely than rejectors to consider a midsize SUV. And in fact, just going down this list here, they're just simply a lot more willing to consider they're a lot more willing to consider a lot of these higher-end vehicle segments. So again, people open to Chinese cars aren't necessarily shopping the bottom end of the market. They're young, relatively affluent people who want nice vehicles. And these are people who aren't considering you know, the cheap lower-end brands like Kia and Mitsubishi and things like that. The top three auto brands that people who are willing to consider Chinese vehicles are open to are Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. So, what are the potential impacts here for incumbent automakers? Well, there's three that come to mind. The first is that the second-tier Japanese automakers stand to suffer really badly. Brands like Mazda and Mitsubishi traditionally do pretty well with younger buyers. You know, Mazda 3 and Mitsubishi Lancer have some of the youngest median ages in the marketplace, and that's basically been considered a strength, except that these are the same sort of younger buyers that really might be open to these Chinese vehicles. So these second-tier Japanese automakers really better watch out. Another potential impact is that the Koreans have been vacating the low end of the market, partially in anticipation of the Chinese taking over that traditional low-end price positioning. But as we can see here, the Chinese really may not be interested in that low end of the market anyways. Particularly if the Geely acquisition of Volvo is any indication. Finally, the Detroit Big Three customers are less likely to consider Chinese vehicles. Our data show that that people who buy American products are less willing to go to Chinese vehicles. However, that's eventually going to change as acceptance of Chinese vehicles grows. So ultimately, longer term, yes, they will be yet another threat to the domestic automakers. And there's one more thing. Does anyone know what this is? This is a lithium-ion battery pack for hybrids and electric vehicles. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the fact that electric vehicles are coming in a big way. Hybrid vehicles are already here, and we're going to see a lot more hybrid vehicles in the coming years, especially with the new fuel economy. Especially with the new fuel economy regulations that are coming into play right now. So these vehicles are coming. And already China is the world leader in batteries. I mean, you know, the little lithium-ion batteries in all your cell phones and in your laptops, chances are they come from China. The batteries, and so therefore the batteries that we see in these electric vehicles and these hybrids, they're also going to come from China or will be sourced with Chinese components. Just as importantly, the Chinese also own most of the world's lanthanides. Lanthanides are better known as rare earth metals, and rare earth metals are essential for high-tech car production. Actually, for that matter, they're essential for just about anything else that's high-tech. You know, our cell phones, our laptops are filled with rare earth metals, and they all come from China. Now, why is this? It's actually sort of an accident of geography. The Chinese just happen to, most of the world's known supply of lanthanides just happen to reside within China's borders, lucky for them. And those that aren't within China's borders, the Chinese have already acquired and control a lot of that, a lot of those locations. Just to give you perspective as to just how much lanthanides there are in a modern high-tech vehicle, the Toyota Prius has 25 pounds worth of lanthanides in it. All comes from China. Now, what we're finding is that China has very little interest in exporting these raw materials. They don't want to export the lanthanides so that other people can make batteries and high-tech components. And to that end, they've actually, in the last year, enacted new higher tariffs on exported lanthanides. Rather, the Chinese are more interested in selling finished components. So, think about that in a consumer electronics context. This MacBook Pro here, made in China. The Chinese don't want to, send out the lanthanides and have someone else build it. No, they want to take those lanthanides, make the laptop the lanthanides go into, and then sell it abroad. Ultimately, that same thinking applies to automobiles as well. So in this new upcoming world of electric vehicles and hybrids, we can really expect to see China becoming a major supplier of the high-tech components that go into these future electric vehicles, and ultimately even finished cars. In fact, that's pretty much a certainty.
Please join us for our next lecture. For a complete schedule, visit our website at www.cba.lmu.edu/cab.